What engineering duties, and stitch yourself in so we know, oh, right, Sandy's an engineer.
Okay. Well, engineers really did have two roles. You know, the reason that we went to Vietnam, which was probably 3 months later than the first Australian troops went over there, which was the battalion, was because they didn't have support when they went out into the field. And when they went out into the field, they would come across things like booby traps or unexploded bombs, ordnance that Australians had never ever dealt with before. So it was well beyond things like the Assault Pioneer Platoon's role. So that's when they actually called for the engineers, because they decided that they needed Australian engineers up there with them. So when we got there to Vietnam, we had the role of working with booby traps, unexploded bombs, and then of course there were tunnels. Now that was the main field role. A couple of times we would be working building roads, building bridges, you know, making ways across into areas that we needed to get to. And the other role for engineers was back in base camp. And when we were back in base camp, we would take part of the perimeter so that we'd act as our own sentries, our own work within the perimeter. And of course here we were doing things like building everything from latrines through to showers, you know, these sorts of things. So we had a construction type role, right, back in base camp, as well as operating things like the rubbish tip, you know, these sorts of things.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
Just in your own way, just tell us about that.
All right. In the province that we were in, which was in Benoit province, the forces were 173rd Airborne Brigade, which was an American brigade, right? We, as a battalion of Australian soldiers plus their engineers, were part of the American forces. When we actually went into the Hobart Woods, now Hobart Woods is in the Iron Triangle, it's one of the major strongholds of the Viet Cong. When we went into there, we were supposed to be the cut-off force, right, for a major divisional sweep going through. What happened was that we landed right on the headquarters of the Cholon Jardin area, right, of the Viet Cong. Now, in this particular operation, we as such were not the cut-off forces anymore. We came across the tunnels as a result of 2 of the Australian soldiers being killed and 2 were wounded, but we didn't know where the shots came from. So what happened was that the Australians cleared the area above ground, and not thinking about tunnels at that stage, of course, and then we still couldn't find the shots, where the shots had come from. And that's when somebody found this thing that looked like an anthill. And in this anthill, it had 2 slits in it. And through there, we could see that it was hollow inside. That's when the engineers were called in. We were out there with them, right? So we blew in the anthill, and there was the inevitable tunnel. And so that was the beginning of us going down the tunnels. Here, what we did was we actually physically went down the tunnels after blowing things like smoke down and CS powder. Now, CS powder is what we call tear gas, right? So tear gas was to get the enemy out of the tunnels before we went down, hopefully, and the smoke was to show us other exits and entrances that we could go into this tunnel system. These tunnels are pretty small. They're so small that you feel on either side of your shoulders, you feel the tunnel. Sometimes you're going down through like trapdoors, going down and up again, right? It's difficult. Then they're never straight. They went for 5 meters, 3 meters. They turn a corner, you know, and they wouldn't go straight. They're just all the time going up and down and around corners. And our boys were searching these tunnels, and what they had to do is they had to go forward all the time, because the tunnels were not big enough to turn around in. We were on our hands and knees and sometimes on our stomach to get past some of these obstacle type areas. And so we had to keep on going forward, and when we went forward, we came to a bigger area, like a room or something like that there, that's when we could turn around and come back again, right? So you can imagine the tunnel clearing going on. We were operating in pairs, and the rear person had a telephone, so that we were always in contact, and we had to lead out the line all the time to these guys going in. The front guy would have sometimes, well, later on actually it was developed, they had a torch on their head, like a miner's light. Otherwise they were holding a torch in their hand. And when they had a torch in their hand, they had a pistol in the other hand, or sometimes a bayonet. The bayonet would be looking for booby traps. The reason we expected booby traps there was because every night when we came out of the tunnels, we'd hear the enemy come back in overnight. So we had to come back in again, and we were expecting booby traps again. The enemy were down there. We could hear them at night time. So what happened was that we were searching out these tunnels, and we went for close to 3/4 of a mile when we were there, right? And we'd find other exits and other entrances. One such exit was really interesting in finding it. What happened was that these guys could see a little bit of daylight, and what we had to do was to have to make sure that we could find that exit above ground, because if they opened it from underground, it'd be booby-trapped. We'd already found a few of those sort of things, you see. So what they did was they fired the shot, and of course they redirected the shot and calling out, and then eventually found it. And that particular entrance had 14 grenades attached to it, right, as booby traps. So had they opened the door, then they would have been in trouble. Right, there is no doubt. So we were able to search out these tunnels, but what was the important thing was that we pulled out so much information from these tunnels. We pulled out over 100,000 sheets of paper. We were right on the headquarters of the Cholon Jardin area. We pulled out explosives, we pulled out weapons, we pulled out all machine guns, we pulled out all sorts of things. And you know, at the end of this particular operation, General Westmoreland said, from now on, we will always go down tunnels. General Westmoreland was the commander of the American forces and Australian forces in Vietnam. And up until that stage, the Americans had not gone down the tunnels, right? When they found an entrance, they blew it up. Now, we know this because, unfortunately, it led to the death of one of our soldiers. What we did was we blew down smoke, because that was sort of like a standing operating procedure to find other exits and entrances. Well, what does smoke do? It burns the oxygen. So when it burns the oxygen, right, you blow down a bit of air after it, right? But you know what? You can never, ever blow down enough air down these tunnels. So what happened was that our soldiers were collapsing down the tunnels. They were collapsing. And as they were collapsing, we had to even haul a couple of them who were totally unconscious backwards out of a tunnel. Now, it was impossible to get them out backwards, really. But unfortunately, Corporal Bob Botel went down one of these tunnels, and he squeezed himself down into an entrance. Squeezed. He was a tall, slim man, 6'2", and he squeezed himself down. And when he squeezed himself down the bottom there was foul air. And we tried to get him out. We tried to push, we tried to blow air in, we put other soldiers down there who tried to pull him out, and we were unable, unfortunately, to get him out. We had to dig him out. And of course, after we dug him out, he was dead. And that's one of the real reasons that we know that we were the first down tunnels. One of the main things that we found out, because of the way we did things over there, was that using smoke doesn't work. And if the Americans had actually used smoke all the time and gone down tunnels, they would know that it doesn't work too, because the guys would be breathing foul air and in fact would be collapsing as well. But so therefore we know that we were really the first down tunnels, because smoke is not the way to go. From then on, we always cleared the tunnels just using tear gas and just using our own ferrets, and we became known, of course, as the ferrets or the tunnel rats, and we searched out many other tunnel systems as well, but never using smoke again, because it was smoke that did the damage.
Thank you.
the Long Tan Association is really interesting because the engineers area that we occupied, in fact, was the first area that was occupied in Nui Dat. We were the first. And the reason that we went to that area was to establish the water point. Not until the water point was established did we, in fact, know that the rest of the troops could join us, because water is extremely important. In this area, it was very open. It was open paddies in front of us, right? And when we moved in there, it was probably one of the most dangerous times we as engineers were actually experiencing in Vietnam, right? In that an early part of Nui Dat. We had to protect ourselves during the day. We had to, and normally we have infantry to protect us, you see, while we get on with some jobs. And we had to protect ourselves. At night time we had to put out patrols, and we know the enemy were there because our patrols had contact with them, right? The enemy were actually surveying the rest of the positions or the whole of the Nui Dat area during this early time. So come I think it's the 18th of August, 17th of August, somewhere there and there anyway, what happened was that the mortars were actually landing, and you know where they were landing? Right in the engineer area. Right in the engineer area. Now, unfortunately, there were 4 or 5 of my guys were wounded at the time, not badly. A lieutenant, no, I beg your pardon. There was a Captain Payne who lost his legs. He was the other troop commander. And for me, I was outside the wire. In fact, I was on another operation with another 20-odd engineers. I'm glad we weren't back in camp, right? So what happened when we got back into camp, we could see the devastation that there was there, but of course all the talk was about the action that had taken place outside the wire, where D Company had gone and actually stopped the enemy attacking, while the enemy was there basically forming up, right, to come in to attack the task force base straight through the engineer area was their intention. D Company, right, of course assisted later on by the armoured boys and a lot of artillery, they broke up the attack. And I'm really glad that I was out of the receiving end of those mortars at that time. You know, as we kept on getting the intelligence, we could hear the fighting. I've actually been back there since then, and it's quite an eerie place, the Long Tan Cross, and where the boys were really fighting for their lives, right? But when we were finding out the truth of what was happening, we were just absolutely amazed that there was only, I think, I know I use the word only, but there was 17 of our guys, I think, killed. It might have been, I don't know the exact numbers, you know. But as we'd hear, another one had been killed or another one had been mortared, another been wounded, I'm sorry. While this was going on, we were really wondering what had happened to the enemy. And you know, we heard estimates, everything from 200 to 2,000 enemy killed. We knew our guys were there fighting for their lives, and not only that, fighting for Australia and fighting for freedom and all of these sort of things. Feeling emotional now, but they were proud moments. The mood of the whole area was one of expectation. We were not sure. You know, we'd heard reports of regiments and of divisions. In other words, we're talking about 5,000 people up to 20,000 people who are out there. We'd heard all of these reports, and we were expecting at that stage to be attacked, even though the company of 6 Ra, D Company, were out there. We were still expecting it. It was like we were on edge all the time. And we and the engineers were on edge even more because it really was the direction they were coming. It was the most vulnerable area. Later on, there was a dam put in and a lot of water, which actually, protected the rest of the task force in between us and the next battalion over. But we were living on edge because it was expectation of them coming through, and it was only after. And of course the artillery is behind us. Well, of course the artillery were going all the time. I mean, it was like the horrendous sounds and noise. But you know, after the lull came and after the 6th Battalion D Company was starting to come back in again, and we knew it was over, it was that feeling of just total pride. Total pride, and there was of course a joyous relief, of course, as well. But these guys had more than done their duty. But there was just an enormous sound of battle, and it was just the artillery itself was just firing all the time. It was like a continuous thing. And of course, now that we've heard how the artillery were calling down within 50 metres of our guys, right? It was just, and these guys were calling the artillery into that stage, and that's what really destroyed a lot of the enemy at that stage. And that firing was just so accurate. We had our own guys who were wounded in that. But my own feelings at the time was, hey, this is what it's all about. The Vietnam War was one of continuous tension. You'd go out on an operation, and sometimes it was great to get out on an operation, you know. And then there was obvious tension that was going on then. But then when you'd come back into base camp, there was still, we had to man the guns, we were on the perimeter, engineers were on the perimeter, like nearly everybody was on the perimeter, and so therefore there were sentries all night. There was total work. There was stand twos in the morning. Stand two means getting up before dawn, being in your pits, you know, and then having while day breaks, then you go back, of course, to your daily routine duties while your sentries stay out there and your patrols go out. So there was tension, really, all the time. When we would get a day off, right, during the day to go into Vung Tau, there was more tension because, you see, Vung Tau was used as a venue for R&C, if you like, rest and recuperation. But it wasn't only used by us. It was also used by the Viet Cong, right? And they'd just come along the beach, right? So they would be, we know they'd be in town, and we'd be in town. And then, of course, if you were in a bar having a drink, you wouldn't know whether, as you opened the bottle of beer, whether that Bambi Bar was a really good bottle, or if it was just the dregs, or whether it was poisonous. Right? You wouldn't know whether the people in the bar were supportive of the forces in Vietnam, our forces in Vietnam, or were supporting the Viet Cong. You wouldn't know. So it was continual tension all the time. Even if you went to Saigon, it was exactly the same thing. So there was no total rest from tension. My guess is that that's one of the major differences between the Second World War particularly and the First World War. These guys, they went through an enormous amount of punishment. But at the same time, when they had fought their battles or done their duties or their 100 days at the front, they came out for a week or two. And when they came out for a week or two or three or four, then what happened was that they were totally able to relax. They were in what we'd call a totally secure area surrounded by friends. So therefore the tension wasn't there for a full 12 months. I think that's one of the major reasons that there is a difference between what happened in Vietnam and what happened in the Second World War and the First World War.